Today's prompt is ancient, and as soon as I looked at that, I thought immediately of in-game things like spaces like in the Forgotten Realms, where you have places like Myth-Drannor, and it's got a history that goes back thousands of years. But then I got to thinking about something that's involved in role-playing games that is legitimately ancient, not just fictionally ancient. Dice. Dice are a part of many role-playing games. Now, there isn't always dice. Some role-playing games will use a deck of cards, but there's always some element of chance, some randomizing mechanic, and the majority of the time it's dice that do the work. And our standard dice, the idea of creating a game with random elements in it, goes back thousands of years. So this is an ancient aspect of role-playing games. We use dice in role-playing games to determine whether or not a character, what the player acts as during the game, succeeds in a task that they are trying to achieve. The dungeon master or the referee can do this as well, although there are some games where the dungeon master / referee does not roll at all, while the players roll everything. There's lots of different types of dice, and there's different ways of using them. The standard dice that we think of as regular old dice are six-sided dice. They're a cube. And there's a game called Tales from the Loop that uses a special edition of six-sided dice to highlight that if you roll a 6 in Tales from the Loop, then you have succeeded. Whereas in Dungeons & Dragons, you have to roll a 20 on a 20-sided dice. This is the oldest 20-sided dice that I own. But the 20-sided dice is at the heart of Dungeons & Dragons. And if you roll a 20, that's really good. But 20 isn't the only number that can make a success, whereas in Tales from the Loop, it's only a 6 that makes a success. There's all sorts of different possibilities that could be successes in Dungeons & Dragons, although generally a 1 is a bad thing. And in combat, it's called rolling a fumble, whereas rolling a 20 is called rolling a critical. It means it's really, really good. I used to play a game called Middleearth role-playing, and these were the dice that I used for that. They're two of my favorite dice. I love these ones that look like crystals, or something beautiful about them. And that's something you should know about gamers and dice, is that they not only purchase dice to play with, but they purchase dice to some degree because they like the way they look. When people decide that they want to play D&D or a game like it, and they go and get their own set of special dice, they tend to sit at a glass case, and they look at a bunch of different types of dice, and they think about what colors they like and whether or not they want them to be a certain material. You can get them made in all sorts of material now, precious metals even. But these dice, they're both 10-sided dice. And if I roll these, I can assign the 10's value to either the purple or the red dice, and then the 1's value to the other. And it can give me a result anywhere between 1 and 100. And one of the games that I used to play with these was Middle-earth role-playing, and it had an open-ended dice convention, where if I rolled a 1 to a 5, it was a fumble, just like that 1 in Dungeons & Dragons, except that in Middle-earth role-playing, you would have to roll those percentile dice again and subtract the result from whatever you had, and so you would start getting into negative integers for the results. Likewise, if you rolled a 95 to 100, you'd roll again and you'd add those numbers. And sometimes you have dice that don't have numbers on them at all. Sometimes you have dice like the ones from Fantasy Flight Games, Star Wars game, although what I have sitting in here is a game that they built off of that Star Wars game called Genesis. And instead of numbers, these dice have symbols. And some of the symbols mean success. And if I get 1 success and no failures, I've succeeded. But if I get a success and a failure, those cancel each other out. But there's more than just success or fail here. There's more than just win or lose. There is also threats and advantages. So these dice enable storytelling in all sorts of ways that the numeric dice don't necessarily do in some of these other games that I've been talking about. But one of the great attractions, I think, about Dungeons & Dragons dice is just that they're so different. A 20-sided dice, where else do you see a 20-sided dice in your everyday? Or a 12-sided dice, or an 8-sided dice, or the one that no one wants to step on, the 4-sided dice. Interesting note about the history of the Dungeons & Dragons dice is that the creators of the game were using them for war games, and they had gotten them from an educational catalog, a teaching catalog, and that's the pedigree of those dice. But today, I think they're better known as those weird dice that go along with Dungeons & Dragons. It doesn't matter what shape the dice are. It doesn't matter what numbers they roll. It just matters that you have a random element that can take the improvisational storytelling that players are doing, that game of pretend, and turn it into something that they can't expect. It's one thing entirely to say that as a player I want to do X, Y, or Z. That's just fantasy. But the moment at which I have to roll the dice and see what the outcome is, and if it's bad, decide why it was bad. Did I slip on something? Was my character thinking about something else? What was on their mind that caused them to fail that roll? And if it's a success, and it's an exceptional success, I can sometimes be called upon as the player or as the dungeon master to describe that success, and it becomes part of that storytelling process. So while the shape of these dice and the way in which they're used is very new, using dice and random elements is definitely ancient.